take it from the top, and then when we get to call to order, we'll turn it back over to you.
Perfect.
So thank you everybody for participating in today's first Environmental Justice Committee meeting. 7 o'clock on the nose, I started our live YouTube feed, so we are broadcasting live via YouTube, which is good for members who are unable to participate, because then they can go back and review the meeting and still stay in step with the committee, provide their comments and go forward. I also just let Lorraine in, so we are good there. If you're joining via Zoom computer, the whole meeting is done via Zoom, so if you wish to comment, whether it's during public comment or as a committee member, you will use the raise hand feature. If you're dialing in to raise your hand, you would do *9 to raise your hand, and you will be unmuted and able to speak at that point. So at this time, I would like to turn it over to our chairwoman, Jenny Knisely.
All right, so we will call this to order, and I guess we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. I will stand up in that awkward stage here. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Can you hear me?
And to the republic
For which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I don't think everybody was saying it. So roll call, Carol?
Okay. Yes. Chairperson Jennifer Knisely.
Here.
Vice Chair Bonnie London.
Here.
Stephanie Youngblood.
Here.
AJ Moyer.
Here.
Lorraine Theobald.
Here.
Let's see, David Ring.
Here.
And auxiliary member Carolyn, is that McCullough? So I know she's here. We're good.
She is here.
Yes.
She's muted, but that's okay. We know she's here.
Okay, then we're good to go.
So I thought there are some members here that may not know each other. We would quickly go around and just say who we are, and I'll just go through the screen the way I am. And then Mary Beth, if you want to introduce afterwards the staff so everybody knows who everybody is, that'd be wonderful. So Stephanie, go ahead.
Hi, I'm a new planning commissioner. Nice to meet you all. Might have seen me around. Yeah, so that's me pretty much. I'm not going to ramble, but hi. Thank you for letting me be on your committee.
And then I have Bonnie.
Hi there. My name's Bonnie London. I'm on the Loomis Planning Commission also, and my background is actually in nursing. So I'm happy to be on this committee.
And David.
Hi everybody, I'm David Ring. I teach at Sierra College, and I've run for town council a couple times, and I'm on several of these committees.
And AJ.
Hello, my name's AJ Moyer. I live in Loomis for a few years. I just recently decided to see if I could get involved with everybody, and hopefully I can contribute some meaningful information.
Great. Carolyn? Oh, you're on. Okay. Carolyn?
She's also on the phone. Carolyn, if you're listening via the phone, you can go ahead and unmute.
All right. We'll go with Lorraine.
Good evening. My name is Lorraine Thebo. I am a retired registered nurse, so it's nice to know there's another nurse on the panel. I am on the Environmental Justice Committee of my union, SEIU Local 10-1, and I'm also a member of Association of Nurses for Healthy Environments. I've lived in Loomis for about 12 years, and my kids went to high school here. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Mary Beth, if you want to turn it over to the staff.
Certainly. I'm Mary Beth Van Boris, Town of Loomis Planning Director. Carol Parker, Planning Assistant, your meeting recorder for the evening. Your technical staff here is Anders Hauge from Hauge Brook and Associates, and also Christy Consolini. She's definitely technical staff. She will be presenting tonight. And we also have on the call our town deputy attorney, Andreas Boer. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
All right, so that sounds like we go to our committee comments for items not on the agenda. We have anybody that on our committee that wants to comment on something that's not on the agenda?
Any of our committee members, you would just raise your hand and you can go forward.
Okay,
None.
Seeing none, I now public comment for items not on the agenda.
So any public attendees, if you wish to speak, you may raise your hand or just unmute and speak. Either way. Oh, you would have to raise your hand so I can allow you to talk. Seeing none.
Okay, so now I'm going to call for the adoption of the agenda.
And for that, I need a motion and a second. Any committee member?
I move to adopt the agenda.
I second it.
That you,
Is
Stephanie,
this-
you seconded it?
Oh, Stephanie.
I know, I couldn't see who did the second.
It was Lorraine.
It was Lorraine. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Okay, let's go with a vote. Jennifer Nisley,
Yes.
Bonnie London,
Yes.
Stephanie Youngblood,
Yes.
AJ Moyer,
Yes.
Lorraine Theobald,
Yes.
David Ring,
Yes.
and Carolyn Macola.
Yes.
Okay,
Great.
did I get everybody?
Sounds like it. So now we'll go to committee matters, and I guess we'll turn it over to Christy.
Yes, we've concluded with introductions pre-item number 1 on the agenda. I would like to at this time turn it over to Christy Consolini, Hauge Brook and Associates, and it's her show. Take it away, Christy.
All right, let me see if I can screen share the presentation.
And while Christy does her presentation, if committee members and public can refrain from comment, maybe keep a little side notepad, write your comments down. We can address those at the end. It helps the presentation go a lot forward quicker. And sometimes some of your questions may be answered during. So we will get to all your questions. So just keep track of them, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Let's get into our agenda. So tonight we have introductions, and which we've completed. Available documents will be on our next slide, and then I'll do an environmental justice overview, the approach, some draft goals, objectives, policies, and implementation measures, the general schedule for the general plan, and next steps. So I will skip over that part on introductions and the available general plan documents. As most of you who are on other committees know, we have our general plan update website. So it's listed at the top. And then in volume 1, there is an environmental justice draft element in there for review. If you go into volume 2, there is a glossary of terms, and that will have some of the definitions we'll be talking about tonight, as well as definitions from other elements and the setting. And then in volume 3, we have the environmental justice setting, which is, it's pretty brief. So those are some documents that I encourage all of you to take a look at and comment on. So an overview of environmental justice. What is environmental justice? It is, it addresses discrimination through unjust land use policies and practices. Historically, policies that discriminate against different groups of people have been based on practices of relocating those groups into less desirable or undesirable hazardous locations, or preventing groups from owning property in certain areas and forcing them into less desirable areas, or allowing for health hazards to persist in areas of your town or in areas where certain groups reside. So issues of environmental justice may occur in relation to access to food and recreation as well. So if you have a community or a portion of your community where there are no grocery stores or markets or parks, those are also considered to be environmental justice issues. So what are our general plan requirements? In 2016, Senate Bill 1000 was passed, and it led to the requirement for an environmental justice element in city and county general plans where disadvantaged communities exist. So the purpose of SB 1000 was to identify objectives and policies to reduce the unique or compounded health risks in disadvantaged communities by means that include, but are not limited to, the reduction of pollution exposure, including the improvement of air quality and the promotion of public facilities, food access, safe and sanitary homes, and physical activity. So safe and sanitary homes includes homes that are in good condition and do not have hazards present. So general plan requirements of SB 1000. So I went over the first item A just now, but the environmental justice element or related environmental justice goals, policies, and objectives integrated in other elements, remember that point, shall do all of the following. So the item that I just read, and then identifying objectives and policies to promote civic engagement in public decision-making processes, and identifying objectives and policies that prioritize improvements and programs that address the needs of disadvantaged communities. So a city subject to that subdivision shall adopt or review the environmental justice element or the environmental justice goals, policies, and objectives in other elements upon the adoption or next revision of two or more elements of the general plan. So other related legislation for environmental justice includes Senate Bill 535, which was passed in 2012, and it directs that 25% of the proceeds from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund go to projects that provide benefits to disadvantaged communities. So, and that also gave the California Environmental Protection Agency responsibility for identifying which communities those are, which communities are considered disadvantaged. And then in 2016, Assembly Bill 1550 was passed, and that requires that 25% of the proceeds are spent on projects located in disadvantaged communities. So disadvantaged communities in California are specifically targeted for the investment of those greenhouse gas reduction funds. So proceeds from the state's cap and trade program. So a couple of key definitions. Environment, and these are in the glossary. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of all races, cultures, incomes, and national origins with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So a disadvantaged community is an area that's been identified by the Cal EPA, and that's further defined as a low-income area that's disproportionately affected by environmental pollution or hazards that can lead to adverse health or environmental effects. And then low-income areas are areas with household incomes below 80% of the statewide median or below thresholds established by the California Department of Housing and Community Development. So how does Cal EPA identify disadvantaged communities? They maintain an environmental justice program and a task force that coordinates compliance and identifies disadvantaged communities. So they have a tool called Cal EnviroScreen, or the California Communities Environmental Health Screening Tool. You can find it online, and you can look up all the different areas of California, and you'll see a map and then also rankings based on various criteria. So Cal EPA maintains that, and they go through the data and rank cities based on their comparison to other areas of California. And then it maps it all out. So you can look and see how your town ranks or how the town next to you ranks. Areas are ranked based on potential risks associated with health and social factors. So some of those factors are pollutants. So we're looking at water quality, air emissions, pesticides, toxic releases and cleanup sites, solid waste buildup. Lead paint is a new category they're adding. And then there's social vulnerability. So we're looking at poverty levels, housing burdens, members of the community's education level, if they have linguistic isolation, unemployment, and then they look at age and race overall for a community. So is Loomis a disadvantaged community? According to Cal EPA, Loomis is not a disadvantaged community. So currently the Cal EnviroScreen data is from June of 2018. And in March, so last month, 2021, they released version 4.0, but it's a draft version. There are some changes, but it's a draft. So I have not integrated that into the setting yet. Once I know that it's pretty finalized, then I'll start to integrate those numbers and you'll see an update in the setting. So per the 2018 data, Southern Loomis is within the lowest risk category, which is 1 to 10%. And the area north of I-80 is within the second lowest category of 11 to 20%. Based on the draft 2021 data, it shows a little bit of a flip-flop. So Southern Loomis ranked 16% and Northern Loomis ranked 13%. Still very, very low. So not reaching that disadvantaged community level in any case. So there are no areas of Loomis considered to be a disadvantaged community. Here's a map that you can find on their website showing the disadvantaged communities. And if you'll see, you've got Loomis over here, and then the nearest sites are way down here, sort of in the Sacramento County, North Highlands area. And then there's also another area up in Auburn where there is a small pocket of a disadvantaged community. So here is the map. And as you'll see, here is Loomis in this area. They go by the census block groups. It's not the town limits. So portions of the rankings are including areas just outside of Loomis. So this area up in here is considered to be part of that northern I-80 Loomis area. And then if you look at the southern portion, it goes all the way out towards the lake, and then it includes portions of Rockland as well. So when we look at the town's rankings, it's not just based on things that are within the town's limits. So there is a little effect of areas surrounding it. So this is extremely hard to read because it's so small, but you can see that these are the rankings, and I'm gonna try to zoom in a little bit. So I have the 2018 rankings and the 2021 draft rankings shown, and you can see that there's a little bit of a change that's occurring, nothing too huge right in there. You can also see what some of the big factors are. So ozone is a high rank. And unfortunately, that's a regional issue that Loomis has very little control over ozone, because air pollution doesn't stop at borders, right? It keeps going. And so we have kind of a regional issue with ozone levels. And then if you look down here with the cleanup sites, there's also a high ranking. And I'll get into this a little bit more, but the cleanup sites are looking at areas that were once considered a hazardous threat. Some of them, most of them have been cleaned up and are no longer active cleanup sites, but they're still listed and they still affect the score. So that's why you're seeing a little bit of a higher number in relation to cleanup sites. And again, and groundwater threats is kind of tied hand in hand with that because it includes, leaking underground storage tanks that may have been associated with gas stations that no longer exist in town or different uses. And then as we scroll down, you'll see that there are some population vulnerability indicators. So we're looking at things like health in terms of asthma, low birth weight, cardiovascular rates, and then also some social indicators. So education levels, poverty, linguistic isolation, unemployment, and housing burden. I'm not sure why the unemployment rate is so high for 2018. I noticed that it did go down quite a bit for the 2021. But anyway, those are the numbers, and they're the 2018 numbers are in the settings, so you can look at them a little bit closer there. And once I have the 2021 settled, then I'll add those in. So factors with higher ratings, as I mentioned, ozone, the entire county is within an area of a elevated ozone level, so exceeding state threshold. So that's going to give that ranking a little bit of a higher number. In terms of cleanup sites, there's a number of sites in Loomis. As I said, the majority are absolutely 100% completed and cleaned up. Those sites have land use limitations on some of them. So one is a former mine, and there's another that's an orchard site with elevated pollution levels based on pesticides usage or storage of fuels that may have leaked, or in the case of the mine, there's elevated arsenic and lead levels. As again, most areas were fully addressed and closed, but those closed cases can still affect that rating. And then there are some areas that are remaining open, but interestingly, they're in Rockland. So unfortunately, the town is affected by some of its neighbors that happen to be in the same census block group. So those are some of those factors. Groundwater, again, related to the cleanup sites. And then I mentioned unemployment, and then the housing burden was a little bit on the elevated side. But again, none of those factors are causing any red flags in terms of being designated a disadvantaged community. So let's go over some scenarios. So from some of the other meetings, I know this has been brought up, the question of, is an environmental justice issue created if higher density residential land uses are located near the railroad track or the freeway? And the answer to that is not necessarily. So if you look at Taylor Road, there are lots of advantages to being located along or near Taylor Road. We have proximity to transit. Park and ride lots are nearby. There's services such as childcare, schools, work centers for people working in the downtown area, community centers, parks, groceries, all sorts of factors that make it desirable to live nearby, near the railroad track, near the freeway. If another thing to look at is if there are other market rate or low density housing in those areas. In those cases, the burden of the location is distributed across different income categories, and lower income groups are not bearing a larger proportion of that burden. So there are existing market rate units near I-80. So we have homes on Hunters Drive, Hunter Oaks Lane, Stone Road, South Walnut, and near the railroad tracks. So we have mixed use housing and RV park on Taylor. There's homes on Orchard Parkway, Cagle Lane, Berg Lane, Frost Lane, all those areas that are sort of above the railroad track area. And another thing to look at is, do we have higher density uses allowed farther away from the freeway and railroad? So if we're allowing them in other areas, it's not a case of forcing low income persons to live in a certain neighborhood. And then, are there ways to reduce, minimize, or mitigate the effects of the proximity to areas with higher pollutant emissions? So can we use setbacks or landscaping, greenways, different methods to sort of set back homes from those higher polluting sources and addressing it in that way. So we can develop policy to address methods that are further carried out through the code. So another scenario is, should higher density residential be located as far away as possible from the railroad tracks and the freeway? And the answer is, again, not necessarily. So if we're putting seniors or affordable housing at the edges of town when there is no transit service, and we're far away from the commercial center and requiring people to travel via a personal vehicle to town for services, that's not a positive for those communities. So increasing vehicle dependence or decreasing access to services increases some of those negative ratings and also increases pollution. So some factors such as cleanup sites tend to be farther away from the town center. So some of the old orchards or the mine sites located sort of, most of them seem to be located in the South Loomis area where we have the larger lots. And moving people out and away over there doesn't necessarily eliminate a social environmental justice issue. So what is our approach? Why should we even include an environmental justice element in the general plan update if it's not a required element, since we don't have a disadvantaged community in Loomis? And I think we should include it because it helps the town to consider and avoid environmental justice issues, and it maintains a healthy community. And that's our number one goal, is having a healthy community. So if we address those issues now, and by issues, I mean health and making sure we have a healthy community, we're avoiding the development of a disadvantaged community in the future. We're ensuring community equity and protecting human health over the lifespan of the general plan. And we're keeping the town compliant with general plan law if a regulatory threshold or a condition should change suddenly. So what are some environmental justice issues to consider? Are there areas of Loomis with high concentrations of pollutants or socially disadvantaged neighborhoods? Is housing affordability and access to fresh food, so groceries, markets, healthcare, or recreational areas an issue for Loomis? How can Loomis provide all the residents with access to affordable housing, fresh food, healthcare, and recreation? What can Loomis do to reduce factors that adversely affect health? And how should the general plan address environmental justice? So I'm going to recommend an approach for all of us to discuss and consider during this meeting. So is the approach that we should, that I'm recommending, is that we provide a general goal, objective, policy, and implementation measures for environmental justice. And we keep that very simple in the environmental justice element. And then we want to reference the goals, objectives, policies, and implementation measures from other elements in the general plan that affect the conditions related to environmental justice. So policies that are related to clean water or clean air, noise management, providing for transit or pedestrian and bike accessibility, access to parks and open space. Those are all topics that are covered in other elements where we can reference those policies instead of recreating or creating new policies related to those same ideas. And by referencing them, it helps to avoid redundancy, and then it also helps to reduce the potential for conflicting statements to arise. So there may be cases where there is an edit to the general plan in the future and it's only edited in one spot. And if we have it again in the environmental justice element, we are opening ourselves up for a conflict potentially if it's not tracked in every location. So some of the draft goals, objectives, policies, and implementation measures, these are some of the topics that we can think about, and we can think about them in the sense of the environmental justice element, but also those other elements that cover these topics. So pollution exposure from air quality or air emissions, water quality and land use compatibility, public services and facilities. Are they provided? Are there areas lacking in those services? Are there areas lacking food access, safe and sanitary homes? Areas where there's limited access to public transit, employment, parks, other services. Are there additional unique or compounded health risks, including climate vulnerability? Do we have policies for civic or community engagement? And how do we prioritize improvements for disadvantaged communities? Those are things to think about. We don't necessarily need to address them in this way, but we should be thinking about those and making sure that the general plan as a whole is addressing the health of the community. So here I have the draft goal, objective, policy, and implementation measure. So the draft goal is, the goal of the Loomis General Plan environmental justice element is to support a thriving community by reducing health and environmental impacts, particularly on disadvantaged or low-income communities within the town. The draft objective is the provision of a full range of access to housing, public facilities, and economic centers, improvement in the quality of the built and natural environment, and promotion of civil engagement. And then I have one draft policy and two draft implementation measures. So the draft policy states, consider environmental justice issues as they pertain to the equitable provision of public services, housing, amenities, and environmental quality. And the implementation measures are, the town shall consider matters of community equity and environmental justice during the public project review process. And the town shall modify the general plan, zoning code, and zoning map to maintain environmental justice within the town and achieve equitable conditions throughout the town. So applicable goals, objectives, policies, and implementation measures are located in other elements as well. So each of the other general plan elements includes some level of an applicable goal, policy, implementation measure. What you'll see in the draft element is that they are referenced in the environmental justice element to fulfill those various policy aspects of the element. So referencing policies from other elements reduces redundancy, again, avoids conflict, and ensures that each element is addressing concerns related to health and equity for each of those topic areas. And in those topic areas where they're most appropriate for discussion, I think it's important to put them there and then reference them within the environmental justice element. So it shows that the environmental justice element addresses these topics by the general plan as a whole, and it's considered under all the elements, not just one. So we'll review those other goals, implementation measures, policies, and objectives that should be referenced in the environmental justice element as these other elements are updated. Right now, you'll see in the draft, it is just some of the existing goals and policies in those other elements as they are today for the town, and they'll need to be updated. So when you're reviewing policies in all of these elements, we need to think about a few things and comment on them. So has the policy been effective? Does the policy or program address the equitable distribution of benefits and environmental burdens? Has it been effective in managing pollution exposure risk or facilitating services in disadvantaged communities? Has it facilitated the development of parks and green space, food markets, safe and active transportation routes? How can the existing policies and programs be strengthened to integrate themes of health, resilience, equity, and environmental justice? And are there additional policies, programs that should be created to reduce pollution, environmental health risks, and other impacts? So the schedule, many of you have seen this before. So we're starting into quarter 2. So we're over in this area here. This is available on the General Plan Update website, so you can look at it in more detail there. Some of our next steps, we want to review all the general plan settings to understand the existing conditions and submit written comments, if any, to the town. So go through them. If you see something that you think needs revision, please let us know. Identify any additional areas or topics of concern in Loomis. Review the goals, objectives, policies, and implementation measures, not only from the environmental justice element, but other elements to determine if they should be referenced or not in the environmental justice element. And we will start to finalize what we are including after we have had a chance to get those other elements up and drafted, and we can finalize that based on your committee comments. So, that's your homework, is to review everything and submit some comments and let me know how you feel about the approach and if you feel something should be changed. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so I can't see any of you. My power went out here at home, so I called in. But I think this is the point where we ask if there's any questions of the committee. Mary Beth, you'll help me because I can't see the presentation. So
You bet I will. Committee members who would like to speak at this point, please raise your hand. You will be called on in the order of raising your hand, I hope. AJ, you may unmute.
Just curious about the unemployment numbers. Is there any relation to retired communities or number of children through a census count?
Yeah, I thought about that and I looked at it, and it's really based on only people of working age, so 16 and over, who are actively looking for a job. I don't know, I still can't figure out why that was placed so high in the 2018 version, unless they're using some type of an estimate for that. I'm not quite sure, but I do know that the 2021 numbers have gone down significantly. So that's a positive. I'm not quite sure what they are comparing it to and why the ranking would be so much higher for that.
David Ring.
Yeah, so I understand that this whole setting is important, but I'm having trouble trying to define what it is we're supposed to be doing here, because all of I looked through all the environmental justice setting that you have, the draft one, and I had a whole bunch of comments on all of those, and my comments, as I'm reading through them now, it's like, oh, this is something that should be brought up to that specific committee. Or so, like, if it's a parks comment, it doesn't, we don't have the issues with environmental justice that would necessitate me to bring it up in this committee. And so it's like, I'm totally fine bringing up all of my comments right now, but I feel like they don't apply to this particular committee. I feel like they apply to different committees, and it's not necessarily just environmental justice, it's just the general plan in general. And so I'm just wondering, I'm looking for a little more direction as to what I should be doing.
Sure.
With this, yeah.
Sure, and yeah, it is a little confusing because by putting the references to these other elements in this element, it puts sort of the burden of creating the correct language onto those other committees. But what I think this committee can do is, one, identify what those topics are, what those policies are, what those implementation measures are from those other elements that we can reference here. So that's one task of identifying what we should include in this element. And then conversely, I think it is important to comment on those other sections to say, I think this language could be further defined or strengthened. Or maybe we need to talk about this aspect of this topic that's not currently covered within those other elements, and provide those comments. And those comments will be distributed to the rest of the team that's working on the general plan. So those comments will be made available. Responses to those comments will be made available to everybody, so that we can kind of integrate our actions together to make sure we're covering everything and everyone is getting the information that they need.
Okay, thanks.
Lorraine, you may proceed.
Thank you. I appreciated David's question because I was having a little difficulty also figuring out, after reading the material, how this fit in with whether you bring up comments here or in other areas. One of the areas where I noticed we're not touching on environmental justice is the cultural and historic aspects of environmental justice in Loomis. And I know that when I look at the demographics, both of Loomis and of the high school in particular, the demographics are very uncharacteristic for California. If you just look at, for example, our high school is over 74% white, and the public high schools in California are only about 23% white. And that ratio is very skewed compared to every place else. And when I look at the history of Loomis, I know that it was a heavily Asian town prior to World War II, when a lot of the land was lost by the Japanese because of the internment. I also know that there's very little reflection here of the fact that, about 200 years ago, this was mostly Native American land. And I think that needs to be built into the issue of environmental justice, that all of those peoples were displaced from our community and have in many ways not been welcomed back. And so I think, personally, I would like to see some evidence within the community that we acknowledge what's happened, and whether it's posters. We recognize the fruit growing of Loomis, but frankly, a lot of that was Asian farmers who did that, and that we don't see that. And I think without understanding a little bit of what's going on in the rest of the country, particularly this week with racial justice, we have to confront it in our own community too. And I think it's, in many ways, if we don't, it's a disservice to our children, because I think that there's reasons why that's happened here in Loomis and why our community is so white, and whether or not, and how we're going to deal with that in the future in terms of housing. Because I've been to the meetings when people talk about, I don't want low-income housing because I don't want that element coming into town. And my family, that's a big issue. It's very insulting and it's very distressing. And I don't want to pretend I'm on an environmental justice committee without somehow talking about the history of this town and why it is what it is and where it's going to be in the future and how it's going to confront those issues as they come up without some type of policy statement, recognition. So that's one of mine. The other question I have is less emotional for me, but certainly a big issue, which is I'd like to know a little bit more about where those solid waste buildup sites are in the mines. And I don't know if the old dump, which I guess is down King Road, is now a park. Is that site completely cleaned up? And is that...
Yeah.
I've heard rumors about it, but I don't even know if it's true. So
I was curious about that, but I didn't see anything on the EnviroStore, which is the state Department of Toxic Health, Department of Toxic Substances Control, their website. So they have a map database. Anyone can access it. You can go look. And I think there's a link somewhere in there for that. But they show you
that site, and I wasn't sure if it's, all the time, if it's because it hasn't been investigated or whether it actually has been and it's been cleared. So I don't know to what extent. And also in terms of solid waste buildup, I know that this is going to become an increasing issue now that California, and in fact the entire United States, is not going to be able to ship out its plastic or its environmentally damaging garbage. And I know that Auburn is confronting this issue, and I don't know to what extent we are going to ultimately have to face where we're putting our solid waste and how that cannot go primarily, as it has in the past, to where it is going to impact environmental justice in our community.
Okay. I mean, those are all things that we can consider. And then And you asked about the mine, and that's some of the ravines areas in the south part of town. There are some old mining sites there, and those are the areas where you're going to find the elevated arsenic and lead levels. They're also on that website with the database, so you can see them. And
Thank
I don't want to cut anybody off, so I'm sorry if I'm doing that because I really can't see you. But I know that Bonnie can probably speak some of the history that's going to be what we're going to be doing next year. And also with regards to the dump, that location is not in the city or town limits. And the park part, it was kind of up above more where the horse arena is. But I don't know about the cleanup part of that, and that's definitely something we can check into. But I do know that park is not in our town limits, so I don't know if that affects the general plan or not.
Is that in Rockland? Technically?
No, you're talking about
No.
the Loomis Park where the dump was?
Yes.
Yeah, that is not, it's not, that's in the unincorporated part of Loomis.
Uh,
Bonnie, go ahead.
Yeah, Lorraine, I can also answer your question on two of them. So over in Montserrat, they did do hydraulic mining. And so those homes, some of the properties where there was extensive mining, they've had to, the owners have had to do the mitigation measures themselves. So that was one. The second one is that, yes, we being Jan Clark-Kretz on the council, some community members, including the Takamotos who own the main drugstore, the library director, and the Historical Society. We are working on a series of events because next year will be the 80th Day of Remembrance when the Japanese were interned. So Sarah is trying to organize a book-wide community read at all levels, and so children up through adults. And so we've just kind of started the brainstorming phase, but trying to reach different segments of our community. So one example is that there's some really interesting World War II documentaries about the Japanese men who served, and trying to maybe show some of those films to to those in our community who are really into history, and there's quite a lot, and it actually it kind of goes across ages in terms of the folks who are fascinated with our history, and then having the California State Librarian come in because there's other just really interesting documents and things that they're able to provide, and and having a dinner. One thing that Takamotos talk about is that every year the Japanese community would have like this annual picnic, and that was a big deal in the community, and not just for the Japanese, it was for everybody. So so those things are in the works. And then last, my question is over to Christy, and I'm just going to try to take a stab at how this might work. When we were trying to work on the library, one thing that we identified is that, most of our schools are the families are fairly well off and affluent. But two of our schools, Loomis Grammar and H. Clark Powers, actually had a surprising high percentage of kids that were getting school supplied lunch. And I think it was like 25% and 30%. And so I guess my question is, do those schools have like safe routes to school to where the kids, have a safe way to be able to walk to school, and, not, have to be either driven or walk in areas where there would be a lot of cars passing, especially on Taylor Road with high emissions. I think that was one question. And then I know that I took a look at our agenda for Parks and Rec and Open Space and saw that instead of the 5 acres per 1,000 residents, we are much lower at like 3 acres, I think it was. And so, again, are those parks maybe located in areas where, again, we've identified that those 2 areas that feed into those schools have a higher proportion of lower socioeconomic households. And then this question is just kind of one that popped up at me as we're starting to try to work on Taylor Road is gentrification something that we're also concerned about, and displacing, you know, families who have been there for many, many years near downtown. And as, you know, again, we try to revitalize, I mean, is that something we should be concerned about as well? So those were all of my questions and input. Thanks.
Great, thanks,
Thank you,
Bonnie.
David Ring.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I agreed with Lorraine's comment, that I just wanted to second it and say that I think that having something in there about the cultural, the history of, not necessarily our history, but that we should be trying to address the cultural disparity that we have in town. And not only that, but on that slide that you had with all the numbers that were, you know, they were so small you couldn't read.
Yeah.
I think everything that has, you know, over maybe 60% is something that we should definitely be mentioning specifically in this setting, saying, look, this is something that the town is really struggling with. Here are hopefully some goals or some policies, not goals, policies that we can implement that will address these issues. And even if the state says we don't have to have this, I think that would help us, because those are the areas that we're really struggling with.
Good, yeah, no, that's a good point. And definitely we want to, there is the table that's in the setting right now. Please take a look at that. And then with those numbers in mind, look at those other elements and think about ways we can incorporate those into the environmental justice element.
So I don't know if there's more people raising their hand, if there's any questions of staff, but then we have to open it up for public comment, and then we can go back and do committee deliberation and discussion according to my little flashlight I'm looking at on my piece of paper. So do we have more questions of staff from our committee?
No additional panelists have their hands raised.
So then we need to open it up for public comment.
Yes. So public persons in attendance, please raise your hand and you will be unmuted and allowed to talk if you have any comments, questions, recommendations. Sonia Coupler, you may proceed.
Hi, I have a question about the Cal Enviro screen, the disadvantaged community rating from 2018 and 2021 draft. It sounded like you said that information was collected through census block groups. And I thought I also heard you say that some of those numbers don't include the town limits of Loomis. You said part of that is Rockland. So how does that fit with our town limits general plan update if some of those numbers that are on that sheet aren't even within our town limits? How do you separate out the things that we're responsible for and the things that other areas are responsible for?
Well, unfortunately you don't. So we don't have any control over how Cal EPA sets their boundaries and collects their data. That is their purview, and we can't control what they do. We do just have to keep in mind that some of our boundaries for these rankings include areas outside the town limit. And I think the important thing is to think about what can we do for Loomis? What are ways that we can keep Loomis healthy regardless of what is happening outside of the borders? So having that information about what's happening in terms of the Cal Enviro screen is an important tool, but I think the bigger tool that we need to focus on is the general plan itself, and what is the general plan saying about maintaining a healthy community. So looking at our transit, our air pollutants, our other, various other factors that play into that the town can control. And not being hung up too much on how Cal EPA is ranking the area in terms of also including some of our neighbors' issues.
Because if the people within our town limits are working really hard on these different issues, but the people over the border that is within that map aren't, we're gonna still get dinged for it, right?
Well, you're so low on the rankings that getting dinged is something I don't see really happening anytime in the near future. It is, you can almost, Loomis can't score lower practically on that scale. It is really, really low. So I wouldn't worry too much about Rockland. I mean, they would have to do something really, really horrible to get Loomis in that type of situation. So try not to worry about what Rockland is doing and just maybe try to focus on what Loomis can show that they're doing to be a healthy community.
When does the 2021 draft, the final, come out? What's the date?
That I don't have the date on. I'm working on finding that out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Any other members of the public that wish to speak at this time? Seeing none. Madam Chair.
Okay, so then we're going to come back and if there's any more discussions, we can do that now. I did want to just make a comment towards one of the things that Bonnie had said about the 3 acres a park per, or you know, that it kind of comes out to 3 acres per park instead of 5. I know back in 2010 when we were doing all that kind of working on the trails and things like that, I know that the town used we have the joint uses with the schools and that, and I know that somehow was used to calculate part of parks. I don't know exactly what I'm saying, but I know that it was somehow with those uses, they kind of considered it part of the parks.
I think that
but
was
I can find out more.
I
can find out more and bring that to you, Mary Beth.
Yeah, no, I think that was in the there's mention of parks in the Parks and Rec 2010 document that was not approved by council, but we resurrected it, marked it all draft, unapproved, all of that, and at least got that out to the Parks and Rec committee. So I think we'll have those numbers coming forward.
Right, but does that make sense that they were using, it wasn't necessarily parks, but they were using part of the school's properties counting towards the parks?
I believe it did indicate that. I just saw it. I didn't go for content on it. I went, oh, okay. They talked about it here.
All right, it's just a comment. That's all.
Yeah, a good one too.
So does anybody else in the committee have any more discussion?
David Ring.
Yeah, I want to just a real quick follow up on the parks with the schools. I'm pretty sure they do count them towards our parks, but on the other hand, they're at least at H. Clark Power is that park. The park is fenced off, and so there's a lot of times where I go as a community member and I can't even get in because it's completely locked. And it's like, oh, this is supposed to be my park. If this is counting as a community park, then it needs to be available. So that's if it's not available, then it should not be counted.
I agree.
But the other thing I wanted to say is to Sonia for calling in, and for anybody else who's out there listening on YouTube, I super appreciate the fact that people listen to these committee meetings and they comment, and I think it's great because I'm on like 3 or 4 of these committees and I have a hard time participating in more than that because it's just, I think it's awesome that we have a community that's willing to, attend these meetings when they're just here as, as a public, get their one public comment in and that's it. And I think that is fabulous. I just want to say how much I love the fact that our community is doing that.
Thank you, David. AJ?
Just out of curiosity, I know we're talking about housing and the environmental for part of it. The business part, I haven't heard anything about the business part and how they play the role and how they're affected by the community and how they affect the communities and what their you know, how they play a part in this game, I guess.
And which business park are you referring to?
Swetzer.
Okay, industrial zone?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'd be looking at that through land use and what are we putting next to our industrial areas or allowing next to our industrial areas in terms of how that might affect environmental justice?
So then that goes back to what David was talking about and how the different committees are going to intertwine with each other to figure out the
Yes,
best routes to get there.
exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. David, go ahead.
Yeah, piggybacking on that, is there something that deals with environmental justice in terms of like minority-owned businesses? Like, is that something that is in there, or just it's not necessarily a disadvantaged community, like in terms of housing, but in terms of businesses, is that something that is defined in the environmental justice setting that by the state, or something that we need to consider?
It's not something that I've noticed that the state is tracking.
Okay.
It's not a factor, but those are all items that we can think about in terms of maybe the economic element or again, in our different land uses and things like that.
Right. But in terms of environmental justice, it's not something that they ultimately,
Yeah.
it would play into. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Any other committee members with questions, comments, discussion? AJ.
So just real quick, it probably has nothing to do with this, but as far as what David was referring to and different businesses and different owners, I work for Kikkoman, which is Japanese owned. I'm Native American, and most everybody that I hire is out of Loomis, and maybe one of those guys falls into the white category. So if we were to look at stuff like that, it is a lot more diverse, I guess, than what it shows for face value, right?
Thank you.
Okay, Mary Beth, is there any more?
No other hands raised, Madam Chair.
All righty. So it says recommendation. We just kind of went over all those kinds of things, right? That you're looking for us to make recommendations on this
Yes.
document?
Yes.
Okay. And the committee assignment is kind of the same thing, to make recommendations on the document, correct?
Right. So read through the drafts that are up there.
Yeah.
Recommend any changes or a change to the approach if you feel like there's something that's missing.
Okay. If there's no more, then I guess we will do that, and then we come back on Monday, May 17th.
Correct.
Okay, Monday's May 17th, and so we adjourn.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope
Thank
I get
you,
my power.
sir.
It says 10 o'clock, I'll get my power back. 510
Oh,
people are
no.
affected.